The backyard in Bon Air smelled of char and cut grass, and the string lights above us were just beginning to glow as the June sun slid behind the fence. I stood beside Naomi. Without looking at me, she reached up and smoothed the sleeve of my blue polo the way you fix something you already think of as yours. Her father stepped over from the grill, tongs still in hand, and studied my face like he was hunting for another one inside it. Then he smiled and asked, plain as day, "So when are you two getting married?" I froze. Naomi said nothing. She didn't deny it. "My name is Damon Ellis, 36 years old, structural engineer at Ravenna Restoration Group, a Richmond firm that puts old buildings back on their feet, churches, warehouses, mills that were standing here long before I ever learned to read a blueprint. I grew up in this city. I never learned how to leave it, and after a while I stopped trying to. I live alone in a narrow brick row house on Church Hill. The walnut floors are uneven from a full century of use. There is one armchair in the living room, one lamp beside it, and one window that looks straight at the white steeple of St. John's Church across the street. On the mantel over the fireplace sits an oak box with my father's carving chisels laid out inside it the way he left them the last morning he ever touched them, and one small wooden sparrow with an unfinished wing. I have kept that bird for 23 years without ever picking up a knife to it. My father, Curtis Ellis, was a carpenter. He worked construction sites all week and carved sparrows on his back porch on Sunday afternoons, giving them away to people he thought would need a small thing to stay. He died of a heart attack when I was 13 years old. I inherited his tools, his patience, and one sentence he used to say every time he handed a bird to somebody. "Sparrows aren't big, they aren't pretty, but they stay." I was married once, Bianca. I don't say her name with any heat anymore. She wanted a bigger life than Richmond could give her. I wanted a life that was enough. We had no children, she never wanted them, and I stopped asking. We signed the last of the papers 2 years ago in a lawyer's office on Franklin Street. After that, I built a quiet routine the way you build a wall, brick by careful brick. Breakfast at Pearlie's before work, site visits until 7 in the evening, Saturdays for whatever the house needed next. Then, last March, Naomi Ashwood came to the firm. The first time I saw her, she was in the drafting room holding a T-square, like somebody who had held one her whole life. She wasn't loud. She wasn't performing. I remember her voice more than anything from that first week low, steady, a little husky when she laughed. I won't describe her more than that. What I remember is the way she stood when she read a drawing. One hand flat on the table, her head slightly tilted, as if she were listening to the building instead of looking at it. By her second week, there was a black coffee, no sugar, sitting on my desk every morning at 9:15. I had never told a single person at Ravenna how I take my coffee. I never asked her about the cup either. I just drank it. Sometimes when we sat across from each other in a meeting, her phone would flash awake between us and I would see her lock screen her nephew, a small boy named Micah, holding up a paper airplane and grinning like he had invented the sky itself. That was the first time I saw her soften, in a way I couldn't explain, the way a person softens when someone at home is waiting for them. She started asking me to lunch, just the two of us. I always went. I told myself it was a coworker thing. I was 36 years old, and I had learned to sit inside my own solitude without feeling hollow, but I hadn't learned how to let another person walk into it. I used to think men my age had two choices: go back to what was broken, or sit still with what was left. Naomi Ashwood was a third option I hadn't dared to name. I remember the coffee at Pearlie's every Tuesday morning, the small tap of her T-square settling onto the metal edge of her desk, and the way the afternoon light slid across the brick face of Old Manchester Church when we walked the site together at 4 o'clock. Small things. Things I catalogued without meaning to. The way a good engineer catalogues a load path without deciding to, without asking permission of himself, just because the shape of it made sense. Until that Saturday in June, I still thought I was only a coworker she was slightly kinder to than most. Naomi laughed uncomfortably. "Dad, he's a coworker." Hank didn't take the question back. He just shrugged, the tongs bobbing in his hand. "All right, but you have been asking about this man at my dinner table for 6 months now. I figured I was doing you a favor by finally saying it out loud." The whole table laughed. I laughed too, because I knew when to. Naomi went a shade darker across the cheekbones and didn't look at me for a full minute. I filed the whole thing away the length of that minute. The way she didn't correct him a second time. The way her hand stayed near her water glass instead of going into her lap. Her sister-in-law, Renata, asked me what I did for a living. I told her. Micah's 6 years old and vibrating with the specific energy of a boy who has just discovered adults exist, ran over holding a paper airplane. He asked if I could make it fly farther. I refolded the front third of the wings, ran a crease along the nose with my thumbnail, weighted the center just barely, and handed it back. He threw it across the yard. It flew twice as far as before. He shrieked with delight, and I caught Naomi looking at me in a way she didn't have time to hide, the look you give someone when a small competence in them lands somewhere very private in you. Later, after the plates were cleared and Renata had taken Micah inside to wash his hands, Naomi pulled me into the kitchen to help her rinse. Her father had gone to sit under the string lights with his two brothers. The house had that Saturday night sound: running water, low voices outside, a screen door thumping on its spring, the faint click of a cooler lid closing on the back deck. "I'm sorry about my dad," she said, elbow deep in the sink. "He didn't mean to put you on the spot." "It's all right," I told her. She went quiet for a moment. Then, without turning her head, she said, "Damon, I did invite you on purpose tonight, but I did not mean for him to ask that." "I know," I said. She looked up for half a second. Then she looked back at the plate in her hands. And that was the moment I saw it. On the kitchen shelf, next to a jar of salt and a small ceramic bowl of change, was a small wooden sparrow. Old, the wing worn smooth by decades of small fingers. The oil finish had gone a warm honey yellow with time. I picked it up before I even thought about it. My hand knew that bird. I knew the exact shape of the cut under its belly, a specific angled line I had traced with my thumb 1,000 times on the sparrow that had sat on my own mantel for 23 years. "Where'd you get this?" I asked. Quiet. "My dad. When I was 5 years old, I called it Sparrow." She smiled down at the sink. "Someone he knew years and years ago carved birds like that for our family." I put it back down. I didn't say anything else. My hand had a very small tremor in it that I hoped she didn't see. I wasn't ready to say out loud what I was already starting to know. On Monday morning, the black coffee was on my desk at 9:15. Naomi walked past and, for exactly 1 second, laid her hand flat on my shoulder. It was the first time she had ever touched me. She kept walking. I sat there without opening a single email for 4 minutes, watching the steam come off the cup and disappear into the fluorescent ceiling of an office I had walked into every day for the past 6 years. The next 3 weeks blurred. We were deep into the Old Manchester Project, a 140-year-old brick church being brought back from a fire in the 1990s, and every night one of us stayed late in the studio, usually both of us. She talked more than she used to. She told me about her mother, who died when she was 14. She told me she chose architecture because her dad had told her a story once. She stopped there. She didn't finish the sentence. I didn't press. That was her right. One night I walked her to her car in the loading lot behind the studio. The streetlights hummed above us. She stopped with her hand on the door and asked me, "Would you believe me if I told you I wanted to meet you before I ever took this job?" I didn't answer. She smiled a small, tired smile. "It's okay. I'm not ready to explain it either." I drove home that night with the radio off. I sat in my kitchen looking at the mantel across the room, at the small oak box and the unfinished sparrow, and for the first time in 23 years, I understood that the bird on my mantel and the bird on her family's kitchen shelf might have come from exactly the same hand. I didn't say it to anyone. I didn't say it to myself out loud, but I started thinking about that sparrow every single night before I fell asleep, where it had been carried, whose hands had held it, how many years it had waited on that shelf, while I was a boy trying to teach myself how to be a man without my father. Somewhere in the middle of that stretch, an old colleague from a firm I no longer worked at texted me. Bianca had been asking about me. She had just moved back to Richmond with her new husband. She was thinking of reaching out. I did not reply. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and let it lie there like a nail I wasn't ready to pull. The strange thing was, in those 3 weeks, Naomi and I existed on the very edge of something we both understood was happening, and neither of us was rushing it. She still brought coffee. I still walked her to her car most nights. We ate lunch outside on the loading bench behind the studio. sharing a paper bag of biscuits from Pearlie's, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that would. She never mentioned her father's question. Neither did I, but sometimes when I set the biscuit down on the paper bag between us, I would catch her watching my hand, my father's hand. Really, if you have ever seen a picture of him, and I would understand, for 1 second, that she saw a person in me I had not yet noticed I had become. One Thursday past 9 at night, we were the last two in the studio. She sat at her desk with a green banker's lamp on, and I sat at mine with the same kind of lamp on. Neither of us said anything for 40 minutes. I could hear the small sound of her pencil against the trace paper. I remember thinking, this is what my father meant. This is the small thing that stays, two people under two lamps, deciding without saying it out loud that this was going to be their life. There are moments in your life when you realize the thing you are inside of isn't new. It has been going on for a long time, in rooms you never sat in the hands of a little girl you never met, with a wooden bird your father carved before you knew how to ride a bike. I felt the shape of that. I did not have the courage yet to hold it in the light. I kept looking at the sparrow on my mantel. 23 years of dust on one unfinished wing. I could not tell whether my father had run out of time or run out of will. I told myself, for the first time, that maybe he hadn't stopped at all. Maybe he had known the bird wasn't his to finish. Then Naomi's small hand on my shoulder Monday morning, again and again in memory. Then the sound of a T-square rolling gently along her desk. Then the black coffee, still warm at 9:15, week after week, without me ever having asked once. I thought my story had closed in 2022, in that lawyer's office on Franklin Street. I did not know that another part of it had already been written before I was even born. Early July, Ravenna held an open house at the finished Old Manchester project. Long tables set under the restored barrel vault, wine in real glasses, industry investors in soft blazers walking slowly along the reclaimed pews. Naomi was standing near the base of the reclaimed staircase, walking a small group through the arched doorway detail she had designed. I was near the west side, talking to a preservation officer from the state. Then I saw her walk in. Bianca. On the arm of a silver-haired man in a tailored suit, her new husband, whose firm was one of the smaller sponsors of the restoration. I hadn't known her name was on the guest list. I hadn't had time to warn Naomi. Bianca came to me first. Same voice, same tilt of the head. Damon, you look well. I hear you have been seeing someone here. I answered the way you answer a security guard when you have nothing to hide but don't want a conversation. Polite, empty. She smiled. I just came to say hi. But she didn't come to say hi. She turned on her heel and walked straight across the room to Naomi. I was 20 feet away, close enough to read the shape of what happened but not the words. Bianca held her phone out. Naomi took it. Naomi read. I watched her shoulders draw in a very small movement, the kind you would miss if you had not spent months watching how she stood at a drafting table. She nodded once, polite, and handed the phone back. Then she turned and slipped through the crowd toward the stairs. She did not look for me. That was the part that told me it was already bad. I found her an hour later at the studio, 3 blocks away. She had turned off the overhead lights. Only the desk lamp was on. She was folding a set of drawings with a very deliberate slowness, as if she needed her hands to do something ordered while the rest of her decided what she was going to say to me. She handed me her phone. The screenshot was a text I had sent Bianca in the middle of 2022, 2 months after the divorce papers were signed. At a moment I no longer recognized as myself, it read, I don't want to add anyone new to my life again, Bianca. I mean it, not for a long time. Maybe not at all. I read it. It was mine. It was me. It was me 2 months after I had lost the version of a life I had spent 9 years building. Bianca had cropped out everything before and everything after. She had handed Naomi one sentence, like a clean piece of evidence in a court she had appointed herself the judge of. Naomi's voice was very even. I'm not angry at you for saying it back then. I have read that sentence 4 times, and I am starting to wonder if I have been building something in my head that you never actually agreed to. I opened my mouth to explain the context, and she stopped me. You don't have to explain it tonight. I need some time. I nodded. I didn't push. I left. Out in the parking lot, Bianca was leaning against the passenger side of a black sedan, smoking. I walked up to her. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. What do you want, Bianca? She shrugged. I saw you happy. I just wanted to make sure she knew who you actually were. You handed her a sentence I said when I was broken, I said. You left out the part where I healed. She smiled without warmth. If you healed, then why did the sentence still hurt her? I did not answer. I walked to my truck. I drove home in silence. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off in the corner. The next morning, at Ravenna, Naomi's desk was empty. She had sent a note to management asking to step off the old Manchester punch list to avoid, in her careful phrasing, image conflict with a donor family. I knew that wasn't the real reason, but it was a good sentence. Naomi was always good at building a clean sentence around a private ache. The coffee didn't come. 9:15 passed. 10, 11. I opened emails I had already read that morning. I put the mug I usually drank from back inside the cabinet because looking at it empty on my desk felt worse than not having it there at all. 2 days in, my phone chimed. It was Micah using Naomi's phone with permission, as she sometimes let him do when he wanted to send a picture of a truck to somebody. He had typed the message himself with a lot of care. Uncle Damon, my plane still flies far. Try one more. I saved the text. I saved the screenshot to my private folder. I sat in my truck in the parking garage of Ravenna and read it 3 times, and then I set my forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there until my breath came back. That week, I stopped thinking about anything else and started thinking about the sparrow. I pulled it down from the mantel. I set it on the kitchen table. I did not touch the chisels. I just sat and looked at it, at the finished body, the smooth back, the 2 eyes worn to a soft polish by 23 years of a boy's thumbs, and the unfinished wing where my father's blade had stopped mid-cut. Then, 3 nights in, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking, and Hank Ashwood's voice came through. Older on the phone than in person. Everything all right, Mr. Ellis? He called me Ellis. Just Ellis. I had never given him my last name. That Saturday in June Naomi had introduced me as Damon, nothing more. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and felt something old and unbalanced start to line itself up on a level surface for the first time. I'm all right, sir, I told him. It wasn't quite true, but it was the answer he was giving me room for. He said, "You take care of yourself now, son," and he hung up. I stood with the phone in my hand a long time after. He had called me son, not a young man he had met once at dinner. Son. Whatever he had put together in the past 3 days, he had put it together without needing my help, and he had called on a Tuesday evening not to ask a question, but to make sure I was still standing. The next day, Bianca sent one more message. Call me if anything changes. I deleted it without opening it. Bianca hadn't lied. That was the worst of it. She had just brought a true sentence out into the light at the angle where it cut the deepest. Some people call that a skill. I don't. I call it what my father would have called it if he had ever met her. He would have said, quiet, without looking up from his workbench. Some folks carve, and some folks just cut. On the 4th night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the sparrow in front of me and the streetlight coming through the front window, I understood something I had missed for 23 years. My father had not left the wing unfinished because he ran out of time. He had left it unfinished because he knew someone else would need to pick the knife up. Friday night. Light rain on the roof of my truck the whole way downtown. I drove to the studio because I knew Naomi would still be there. She folded drawings when she couldn't decide what to say. The door was unlocked. She was standing under a single desk lamp, and she did not turn around when I came in. I set the sparrow down on her desk without a word. The unfinished wing, the rough chisel marks, the small hollow where my father's blade had stopped. She picked it up. She lifted it toward the lamp. It wasn't her face I was watching, it was her hands. Her hands were shaking. I said, "My father carved sparrows. He gave them to people he thought would need a small thing to stay. He died when I was 13 years old. This one, he never finished the wing." She set the bird down very gently on the drafting table. And then she told me everything. Her voice stayed level. Her hands stayed on the table too, palm down against the paper, as if the flat wood was what let her keep talking. When she was 18, choosing what to study, her father had reached into a drawer and pulled out an old newspaper clipping. It was folded so thin it had gone soft at the crease. One paragraph was underlined in blue pen. It said that a young engineer named D. Ellis had caught a load-bearing miscalculation at a warehouse conversion on the James River, and that 3 subcontractors on the second floor had been evacuated 40 minutes before a wall came down. Her father had been one of those 3 men. He had never met the engineer. He had never learned the first name behind the initial. He had just kept the clipping in the drawer, and he had told his daughter, when she was choosing a career, that some men build things and some men catch other men's mistakes before those mistakes catch people, and both were honorable work. When she was 28, working at a firm in Charlotte, she came across a project spotlight from Ravenna Restoration in a preservation trade journal, a write-up on the old Manchester church proposal. The lead structural engineer was named Damon Ellis. She understood immediately. Ravenna's careers page had a junior architect opening posted that same week. She applied. She asked to be placed on the old Manchester project, which was the largest thing on my desk that quarter. She did not tell her father. She did not tell anyone. She was afraid that if she said it out loud, everything would turn into a debt, and she did not want to meet me as a debt. She wanted to meet me the way an ordinary person meets an ordinary person. The coffee at 9:15, she had heard me order it at Pearlie's her second week at the firm, and she had remembered. The sparrow on her desk at the studio, the one I had glanced at 100 times without ever connecting anything, was the one her father had given her when she was 5 years old. She had carried it with her from apartment to apartment for 25 years. She had brought it into the studio because it made her feel less alone at the drafting table. She looked at me and said, "I'm not sitting here to make you owe me anything. I'm not sitting here to make you owe my father anything. I'm sitting here because I have been waiting for a person since I was too young to understand who I was waiting for, and I am 30 years old now. I don't want to wait in the dark anymore." I did not say much. I picked up her hand. I put the unfinished sparrow into her palm and closed her fingers around it. I said, "My father left this bird without a wing. I kept it for 23 years. I thought I kept it because I wasn't good enough to finish it. Now I know I kept it so I could put it into the right hand today," she cried. Not loudly, just the smallest tilt of her head against my shoulder. I did not move. Saturday morning, I drove out to Bon Air without calling first. Hank was on the front porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sprinkler go across his lawn. I sat down on the step below him. I set the unfinished sparrow on the wood between us. He picked it up. He turned it over twice. He ran his thumb along the underside where my father's chisel had left the mark I would have recognized in the dark. Then he set it down very carefully and turned his face away from me and cried the way older men cry quietly, without moving, when something very old finally comes back into the room it belonged in. "Curtis," he said. His voice was thin. "This is Curtis's knife. Your daddy carved my Naomi's sparrow. I didn't go to his funeral. I was on a job in Norfolk. I sent flowers. I thought I'd settled it." I shook my head. "My father didn't count debts, sir. He just carved birds." He put his hand over mine on the wood of the porch step and left it there a long time. That afternoon Bianca sent me another message. I did not open it. I left it sitting there in my inbox. That was the last time she showed up anywhere in my story. There are days when I used to think I had walked a very long distance alone. Then I understood that my father had walked a stretch of that road ahead of me, and he had left the exact footprints I would need to follow. I did not decide to love Naomi Ashwood that night at the studio. I only stopped forbidding myself the thing that had already started the second week. She set the first cup of coffee on my desk. We loved each other slowly. We did not move in together right away. She kept her place in Bon Air. I kept mine on Church Hill. We had dinner 3 nights a week. She cooked. I did the dishes. She brought her T-square to my kitchen table, and we worked on the Second Baptist restoration together. I was on structural. She was on interior envelope. We fought exactly once, about the east wall. She was right. I lost. I told her so at breakfast the next morning, and she laughed her low, husky laugh and said, "I know you did." Micah started coming over on Saturday afternoons with Renata. He called me Uncle D. He asked me to teach him more airplane folds. I taught him a glider that could ride the draft from the porch to the sidewalk, and a dart that could turn corners if he flicked his wrist just right. Some Saturdays he fell asleep on my single armchair with a folded plane still in his hand, while Renata and I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking quietly about her brother's crew and the new place she was thinking of renting. The afternoon light off the street, John's steeple crossed slowly over the walnut floor. There was nothing loud in those afternoons. Nothing wrong. Just a boy's steady breathing and a woman patiently letting me be part of her son's life. One October evening, Naomi came in from the market and set 2 grocery bags on the counter. She looked around my kitchen at the single mug on the drying rack, at the one chair pulled out and filed it away the same way I had filed her hand on my shoulder that Monday morning. She did not ask me to buy a second mug. She brought one from her place the next week, set it in the cabinet, and started leaving it there between visits. In the second week of September, I picked up my father's chisels for the first time in 23 years. My hands were clumsy on the small tools. I made a wrong cut and set the piece down. I sat on the floor of my back workshop and stared at it for an hour. I tried again the next Sunday. I made a different wrong cut, but it was a little less wrong than the first. I decided from the start that I would not sand my father's work down to make my work match his. His chisel had a heavier hand than mine. I would leave his marks alone. I would only carve the wing that was still missing, and I would carve it a shade thinner than his body, so that anyone who looked closely would see where his hand had ended and mine had begun. I worked on that wing every Sunday from September through the following April. 7 months. One cold Sunday in March, Hank called and asked if I could come out and help him rehang the garden gate at his place. We worked side by side for about an hour, mostly in silence. The way men work when they have already said the important thing. When we were done, he took me into his garage and handed me a small cedar box. Inside were 2 letters my father had written him, one from 1989, one from 1999. He had kept them all this time. I read them in my truck before I drove home. In the second one, my father had written, in the same slanted print I remembered from birthday cards on my kitchen counter, "So your girl's 5 already, huh, Hank? I carved her a bird, sending it out to you. Tell her sparrows aren't big, they aren't pretty, but they stay." I sat in the driveway with the engine off for a long time after I read that. The rain started, stopped, started again. I did not cry. I kept the letter in my hand and watched water run down the windshield. 1 year after the June dinner where Hank Ashwood had asked when we were getting married, we got married. It was a small wedding in his backyard. The same string lights. The same grill, the same wooden fence with the honeysuckle running along the top rail. This time I wore a linen shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, gray trousers, and a pair of leather shoes my father had polished for me at my high school graduation, and I had polished once a year ever since. Naomi walked out to me. I won't describe her here. I will only say that her hand touched mine, and I knew everything I needed to know. Hank stood in as the unofficial officiant because he would not leave his grill. He said his piece in less than 10 sentences. He said, "Curtis Ellis carved sparrows. I kept one of his for 30-something years. Today, these 2 standing here, that bird finished its flight home." On the small pine table where guests signed the book, I set the 2 wooden sparrows side by side. Naomi's sparrow, carved by my father in 1999, and the once unfinished sparrow, started by my father in the last year of his life, and completed by his son in 2025. They did not match. One was old, one was new. One had stayed, one had just arrived. Standing next to each other, they made a kind of quiet sense. Micah, 7 years old now, was our ring bearer. He did not drop the rings. He grinned so hard his whole face folded up, and he did not understand why Uncle D had wet eyes for most of the ceremony. The next morning, Naomi and I sat on the porch of the Churchill house drinking coffee. I finally asked her when she had started taking hers black. "Ravenna, first week," she said, laughing. "I wanted to be like you. Then I actually grew to like it." I did not say anything for a while. I looked at the sparrow, the finished one, sitting on the top step where I had set it down that morning before she woke up. I watched the morning come up over the roof of St. John's. I watched a life that I had thought closed shut in 2022 open up in a place I had not dared to hope for. One April night, before the wedding, a call came through from an unknown number. I let it ring out. Later I checked, and it was Bianca. I did not call her back. That was the last line I ever needed to draw. Some doors you close by not answering. My father had once said, "Sparrows aren't beautiful." He was wrong about that. They are beautiful just in a way you have to live a long enough life to see clearly. We did not marry fast. We married right after all the loops a story has to run through before it finally reaches the right person to carry it forward. I'm sitting on the porch of the Churchill house writing this down. On the top step in front of me, in the last of the evening light, are two small wooden birds. One my father carved in 1999. One my father started in 2001, and I finished 24 years later. I used to think my life had closed at 34 when I signed the divorce papers. I used to think what my father left me was a box of chisels and one bird missing a wing. I used to think that Saturday dinner in Bon Air was a polite call on a coworker's family. I was wrong about all three. My father did not leave me chisels and a bird. He left me a way to live. Carve small things, give them to the right people, don't keep score. Bianca taught me the truth can be used like a blade. Naomi taught me the truth can also be a sparrow, thin, small, slow, but the one that stays. Hank Ashwood taught me that some debts are never called in. They wait quietly until the son of the man who paid them knocks on the door on a June evening in a blue polo shirt. My father carved sparrows to give to other people. I thought I inherited the knife. Turns out I inherited the reason. If you found out that someone in your life had been prepared for you by your own parents before you were ready to grow up, would you stay or would you run? And is there a wooden sparrow somewhere in your life, a small thing you thought meant nothing, but that has been waiting to tell the whole story? If any part of this reached you tonight, hit like so I know you're still here. Subscribe so the next story finds you. Comment below. What is the wooden sparrow in your life? I read every one the way I read every letter my father left behind.